When the billionaire CEO finally stepped on stage, something in the room shifted. Not a sound, not a breath, not even the subtle hum of late-evening conversation remained. It was as if every molecule of air paused mid-motion. People who came expecting another predictable keynote, another corporate success story, another polished speech filled with clichés, suddenly felt an ache of anticipation thrown through their chest. No one could name it, no one could articulate it, but everyone recognized it. A moment was about to arrive. A moment that would not politely knock. A moment that would kick the door open, walk in, and rearrange every assumption inside the minds listening. He stood there, not as an icon. Not as a billionaire, not as a perfect man, because none of those labels were ever what made his presence different, but as someone who had climbed through storms, swallowed failures, been humiliated, doubted, betrayed, underestimated, copied, criticized, and still somehow remained unbroken. He didn't look unstoppable. He looked inevitable. And when he finally spoke, his first words sliced straight through the air: "Your destiny isn't waiting for you. It's being wasted by you." Every spine stiffened. Every eyelid fluttered. Some people gripped the armrests of their chairs, unsure why they felt exposed. He continued, "People talk about destiny like it's a gift. Like it's a package that arrives someday. Like one morning you'll wake up and suddenly everything will align because the universe decided it's finally your turn. That's not destiny. That's a fantasy." He paced slowly, his steps echoing with that quiet, dangerous confidence only earned through years of surviving the unimaginable. Destiny isn't delivered. Destiny is built, with your decisions, your discipline, your daily habits, your internal war with your excuses. Destiny is not what you're born for. It's what you're willing to bleed for. A few people exchanged glances. Others froze completely. It was the tone, unapologetic, unfiltered, real in a way few powerful people dared to be. "You think I became successful because I was lucky?" he asked, raising a brow, almost amused. Luck is what people say when they're too afraid to face their own laziness. You don't get lucky enough to outperform people who are starving for a different life. You don't get lucky enough to rise above the versions of yourself that would rather sleep, procrastinate, postpone, complain, and pretend there's always tomorrow. Someone in the front row swallowed hard. The CEO's eyes scanned the room like he could the hidden truth each person carried, every abandoned dream, every excuse rehearsed so often it became a personal motto, every quiet fear they tried to mask with busy schedules and superficial ambition. He leaned into the microphone and said, "If you're honest with yourself, brutally honest, you know exactly why you're not where you want to be. It's because you've been negotiating with your future like it owes you something. You've been bargaining with your potential, procrastinating like you'll live twice, lying to yourself like lies don't have consequences. But the truth?" He paused for a moment, letting the tension build. Your destiny is suffocating. Because you're refusing to show up for it. A shiver coursed through the room. Because for the first time, many realized that wasn't an insult. It was a mirror, he continued, softer but sharper. Every person in this room has felt that quiet guilt inside them. The guilt of knowing you're capable of more. The guilt of knowing you're pretending to be smaller than you are. The guilt of ignoring the ideas that won't leave you alone, the dreams that stalk you even when you try to bury them under routine and responsibility. He tilted his head slightly. That guilt isn't there to punish you. It's there to remind you. It's the voice of your destiny whispering, I am still here. The silence in the room thickened. People weren't just listening, they were remembering. Remembering who they wanted to be before life taught them to settle. Before fear taught them to shrink. Before comfort taught them to compromise. Before the world taught them to be realistic. You want to know the truth about me? He asked. Almost casually. The truth people don't like to hear. The truth people call arrogant because it forces them to face their own potential. He stepped closer to the edge of the stage. I am not extraordinary. I am not a genius. I am not superhuman. I am simply someone who refused to quit long enough to become dangerous. Somewhere in the back, someone exhaled shakily. You think destiny favors the talented? No. Destiny favors the disciplined. You think destiny favors the gifted? No. Destiny favors the relentless. You think destiny favors the privileged? No. Destiny favors the obsessed. He paused, letting that sink deep. You don't need more motivation. You need honesty. You don't need more time. You need priorities. You don't need permission. You need courage. And courage isn't a feeling, it's a decision. There was no applause, not because the words weren't powerful, but because they were too powerful. The room wasn't an audience anymore, it was a confrontation. He continued, people ask me, what's the secret, as if I've been keeping a treasure map from the world. The secret is simple, most people want success until it requires effort. Most people want change until it requires discomfort. Most people want greatness until it requires isolation. Most people want to win until they realize the price is everything they're unwilling to give up. His voice hardened. But destiny doesn't negotiate with comfort. It doesn't bargain with your excuses. It doesn't discount itself because you feel tired, unmotivated, scared, or insecure. Destiny demands the version of you that shows up when everyone else quits. The version of you that chooses progress over perfection. The version of you that chooses consistency over convenience. The version of you that chooses the future over the temporary. He lifted a hand slightly. And here's the bombshell most people never want to hear, you already know what you need to do. You're just hoping someone will give you a shortcut. There is no shortcut. There is no elevator. There is no fast lane. He smiled faintly, not unkindly. But there is a staircase. And the steps never disappear. They just wait. Someone in the second row blinked back tears they didn't expect. Because they knew. Everyone knew. The staircase was always there, they just had excuses for not climbing it. You think you're stuck, he continued. But you're not stuck. You're stalled. And the difference is important. Stuck means you can't move. Stalled means you won't. He let that settle, watching as the realization hit people like quiet lightning. You are not powerless, he said firmly. You are powerful, but you are misusing your power. You use your imagination to create fear instead of vision. You use your time to maintain the life you hate instead of building the life you want. You use your mind to replay failures instead of rehearsing greatness. You use your energy to protect your comfort instead of fueling your growth. He shook his head slowly. And then you wonder why your destiny feels out of reach. A few people looked down at their hands, realizing he was right. This was not a speech. This was a demolition. A dismantling of every excuse. A burning down of every illusion. A clearing of every mental fog. And yet, somehow, it didn't hurt. It healed. You are dangerous, he said, eyes narrowing with conviction. Not because of what you've done, but because of what you're capable of. And that potential, it is bigger than the fear that hides it. Bigger than the doubts that bully it. Bigger than the past that haunts it. His voice lowered. But potential is worthless without action. Destiny is worthless without discipline. Dreams are worthless without execution. He took a breath and said the line that made the entire crowd freeze, the sentence that later became the headline, the clip shared millions of times, the quote people tattooed on their ribs, wrote in journals, whispered before big decisions, repeated to themselves in dark rooms. Your destiny isn't in the stars. It's in your spine. No one moved, he continued, it's in your ability to stand up when everything collapses. It's in your willingness to try again when no one believes in you. It's in your refusal to shrink, your resistance to comfort. Your rejection of mediocrity. It's in your persistence, your hunger, your resilience, your discipline. He stepped back slightly, the intensity in his voice unwavering. So let me tell you the truth you've been avoiding, your destiny is not waiting. It's watching. It's watching what you do when no one applauds. It's watching what you do when you're tired. It's watching what you do when you fail. It's watching what you do when you're afraid. It's watching what you do when you're alone. The room felt electric, not with excitement, but with awakening. He pointed subtly toward the crowd. Some of you in this room are one decision away from a completely different life. And you know exactly which decision I'm talking about. That thing you've been avoiding. That risk you've been postponing. That change you've been resisting. That conversation you've been afraid to have. That dream you've been shrinking to fit into your comfort zone. He shook his head. Your destiny will not unfold until you do. He inhaled deeply, then said, "Do you know why I never quit? Because I decided the pain of staying the same was worse than the pain of change. I decided my future family deserved a better version of me. I decided my dreams were allowed to inconvenience me. I decided my destiny wasn't optional." He paused. "What have you decided?" People didn't answer. They couldn't. This wasn't a question for the room. It was a question for the soul. He continued, "You keep waiting for the right moment. But the right moment isn't real. There is only the moment you choose. You keep waiting for motivation. But motivation doesn't build empires. Discipline does. You keep waiting for certainty. But certainty is the enemy of growth. You keep waiting for permission. But the only permission you need is your own." He stood still, letting his presence fill the room. You think you need to be fearless to change your life. You don't. You just need to stop letting fear drive. A soft murmur rippled through the crowd. He said, "Fear will always exist. Doubt will always exist. Failure will always exist. But so will the chance to rise. So will the opportunity to evolve. So will the possibility of transformation." He clasped his hands behind his back. "Let me tell you what destiny actually is. Destiny is the version of you you finally decide to become." Another wave of silence swept through the room. "You are not chasing destiny," he said. "You are catching up to it. And it has been waiting so long for you to stop running from yourself." For the first time, he smiled, a small, knowing smile, like he could already see the future versions of the people before him. 5 years from now, you will thank yourself for starting today. Or you will regret yourself for delaying again. Both futures exist. Only one becomes real. He leaned forward slightly. Choose the one that scares you. Not the one that comforts you. He took a step back, signaling the end of his message, but then paused, as if remembering something essential. "One last thing," he said quietly, yet with more force than anything prior. "If you knew who you could become, you wouldn't recognize your current life. And that should excite you. And terrify you. And push you." His eyes swept across every frozen face in the room. "Your destiny is not a mystery. It's a decision. Make it." And with that, he walked off the stage, but the crowd didn't move. They didn't clap. They didn't breathe. They just sat there, stunned, shaken, awakened, not because a billionaire CEO had spoken, but because he had told them the truth they had known all along, and in that suspended stillness, in that electric silence, something irreversible happened. Long after the billionaire CEO stepped off the stage, the room still felt altered. People finally began to stir, but the silence didn't lift because it wasn't silence anymore, it was reflection. It was confrontation. It was the weight of every unmade decision pressing on the chest of everyone who had heard him. Some people looked stunned. Others looked conflicted. A few looked like something inside them had cracked open, a shell they'd been living in for years. But everyone, absolutely everyone, felt changed in a way they didn't yet know how to articulate. Slowly, the audience started to file out. Some walked rigidly, others walked as though they were afraid to break whatever invisible thread was still holding them together. A handful lingered in the aisles, staring at the empty stage like it still held answers they weren't ready to face. There was a sense, an unmistakable one, that something had shifted in the gravitational pull of their own lives. Their excuses felt heavier. Their potential felt louder. One man remained seated long after the rest. He was in his 30s, maybe early 40s, wearing a suit that looked a little too worn for an event like this, a tie that had been loosened halfway through the speech because the truth had hit him too hard, too fast. He had a tiredness in his eyes, the kind of tiredness that doesn't come from work, but from years of postponing who he could be. As the room emptied, he pressed his elbows to his knees and covered his face with his hands. Not because he was embarrassed, but because everything the CEO said felt like it had been aimed specifically, surgically, at him. He whispered to himself, "I should have started years ago." The words sounded brittle. Regret always does. Behind him, a woman in her late 20s stood frozen near the back row. Her jaw was clenched. Not out of anger, but because she had never realized how much she had been suffocating under the expectations of others. Her whole life had been built around permission she didn't need. She had ideas, brilliant ones, but always buried them under polite obligations and the fear of disappointing people who were never going to live her life for her. Now, after hearing those words, she felt something she hadn't felt in years. A spark. A pulse. A rebellion inside her bones. Across the hall, a young man paced back and forth, running his hands through his hair. He looked like someone who had just woken up in the wrong century. A version of him had always wanted to create, build, try, explore, risk, but he had convinced himself life was safer when he played it small. But now safety felt suffocating. Mediocrity felt offensive. Comfort felt like a trap. And he was furious, not at the speaker, but at himself. Furious because he suddenly realized that fear had never been the enemy. His obedience to it had been. As the last of the crowd began to leave, the staff started cleaning the stage, rolling up cords, stacking chairs, shutting down lights. But even they moved slower, like they were afraid to disrupt the lingering electricity in the air. A few exchanged quiet glances, trying to pretend they hadn't been listening, but the truth was obvious. They had felt it too. Everyone had. Outside the auditorium, the night was unusually still. The city's usual noise felt muffled, like even the world outside had paused in respect for the truth that had been spoken. People stepped out into the cool air, but the chill didn't register. Their minds were somewhere else entirely, replaying every word and then replaying every moment in their own lives that those words applied to. The man in the worn suit finally stepped outside. He stood under the streetlight, looking up at the sky like he expected to find his old dreams hanging up there, waiting for him to claim them. He exhaled sharply, a mix of fear and awakening. He knew things would not magically change tonight. But something inside him had. Something irreversible. He felt the guilt of wasted years, but also the possibility of the years ahead. A possibility he had avoided for far too long. The woman who had been frozen in the back row walked to the sidewalk with her hands trembling slightly. She wasn't afraid, not anymore. Her mind was racing with ideas she had buried, sacrifices she had avoided, truths she had suppressed. For the first time in her life, she felt like she was the one holding the pen. And she finally understood she had been letting other people write her story for too long. Tonight, she decided something quietly monumental. She was done shrinking. The young man who had paced inside now walked briskly through the night, almost like he needed to burn off the restless energy tearing through him. Every sentence from the CEO hit him like a drumbeat. One decision away. One choice away. One act of courage away. He felt it. He knew it. He even knew the exact dream he had been running from. It wasn't that he didn't believe in it, it was that he didn't believe in himself. And that was the problem. That had always been the problem. But not anymore. Not after tonight. Somewhere in the distance, the billionaire CEO stood at the edge of the building's rooftop, looking out at the city lights. He didn't stay to mingle. He never did. He didn't care for applause. Applause was noise. Noise never built destinies. He cared for impact. And tonight, he felt it, not because people clapped, but because the silence in that room had been the purest kind of acknowledgement. The silence of minds changing. The silence of excuses dying. The silence of people confronting what they had avoided for years. He closed his eyes briefly, letting the wind sweep across his face. He knew something most people didn't. Transformation doesn't happen while you're sitting in a comfortable seat listening to a powerful speech. It happens the moment you walk out of the room and face the life you've been living. It happens when the inspiration wears off and the discipline has to take over. It happens quietly, stubbornly, brutally, and beautifully, but he had done his part. He had delivered the truth. Unfiltered. Unsoftened. Unapologetic. Down below, the crowd dispersed into the night like sparks drifting from a fire. Most people would feel inspired for a day or two, maybe 3, then return to their routines. But a few had heard something different tonight. They hadn't heard motivation. They had heard a warning. A challenge. A line drawn in the sand. A call that wouldn't let them go back to who they were before the speech, and those few were the ones who mattered. The ones who would go home tonight not with inspiration, but with responsibility. The ones who would lie awake replaying every sentence because they knew the truth now, and truth, once known, becomes impossible to ignore. The man in the worn suit drove home slowly, his grip tight on the steering wheel. His apartment was small, quiet, dimly lit, but tonight it felt different, not because anything changed, but because he knew he had to. He sat at his kitchen table, staring at a notebook he hadn't opened in years. It held plans he'd written when he still believed in himself. He flipped through it slowly, his chest tightening with every page. He whispered, "I'm not done. I'm not done yet." And for the first time in a long time, he believed it. The woman sat at her desk, her laptop open to a blank page. Usually that blank page terrified her. But tonight she didn't feel fear. She felt possibility. She typed the first sentence, shaky, uncertain, imperfect, but it was a beginning. A beginning she had postponed for far too long. Tonight, she didn't need perfect. She needed progress. And she was finally willing to demand it from herself. The young man sat in his room, the tools of his long-abandoned passion scattered around him. He held one of them gently in his hands, like greeting an old friend he had betrayed. "I don't care how long it takes," he whispered. "But I'm not quitting this time." The words weren't loud. They didn't need to be. He had made a promise, to his future self. A promise destiny would hold him accountable for. Across the city, in dozens of homes, hundreds of minds were battling the same internal storm. Hope and fear wrestling in the dark. Excitement and doubt clawing at each other. The desire to change fighting the temptation to remain the same. The CEO's words weren't motivation, they were a mirror. And now, everyone had to face what they saw. Some cried quietly. Some sat in silence. Some paced. Some wrote. Some prayed. Some planned. Some finally breathed. But all of them felt the same truth pulsing through their chest. They could no longer pretend they didn't know what they needed to do. They could no longer pretend destiny was something that happened to them. They could no longer pretend they had time. Tonight wasn't about inspiration. It was about accountability, and destiny, patient, relentless, waiting in the shadows all these years, finally stirred. The city was quiet, but inside countless minds, a storm was rising. A storm that had waited years, some entire lifetimes, to begin. For many, tonight felt like the first time they had seen themselves clearly, without excuses, without filters, without the soft blur of denial. They saw the gap between who they were and who they could be. And that realization wasn't comfortable. It wasn't supposed to be. Growth never is, but transformation always begins when comfort ends. The man in the worn suit sat at his kitchen table long after midnight, the same notebook open in front of him. Not the old version of him who used to dream before life taught him to settle, but the version he had been avoiding, the one who still wanted more. He wrote his goals again, but this time he didn't write what he hoped to achieve. He wrote what he refused to tolerate. Because he finally understood something the CEO said without saying: your destiny doesn't begin with ambition. It begins with intolerance. Intolerance for who you were pretending to be. Intolerance for excuses. Intolerance for stagnation. Intolerance for the limits you inherited from your past. He flipped the page and wrote, with trembling determination, no more negotiations. And as he wrote it, he felt the old version of himself begin to dissolve. The woman at her desk kept typing, the glow of the screen illuminating her focused expression. Hours passed unnoticed. Every sentence she wrote felt like a piece of her true self finally escaping from the cage she had built around her ambitions. She wasn't writing for approval. She wasn't writing to impress. She wasn't writing to be accepted. She was writing because something in her had been awakened. Something she didn't even know had survived all these years of silence. She whispered, "I choose myself," and the words tasted like freedom. The young man surrounded by his creative tools didn't sleep. He worked through the night, driven not by adrenaline but by purpose, raw, urgent, overdue purpose. His hands moved with an energy he didn't recognize at first. It wasn't excitement. It was alignment. For the first time in his life, his actions matched his calling. And he felt a quiet certainty settle into his bones. He was not behind. He was beginning exactly when he needed to. Across the city, the billionaire CEO remained on the rooftop, watching the horizon shift from black to deep blue as the first hint of dawn began to rise. People often thought he enjoyed delivering harsh truths. They were wrong. It wasn't enjoyment. It was responsibility. He remembered the nights when he had no guidance, no mentor, no direction, only failure, confusion, and a stubborn refusal to die unchanged. He remembered the days he almost quit. The years he felt invisible. The moments life punched him so hard he questioned whether destiny was even real, but he had learned something essential: destiny isn't revealed to the comfortable. It's revealed to the broken, to the desperate, to the hungry, to those willing to tear apart the version of themselves that was built from fear. That's why he spoke the way he did tonight, because he knew most people don't change when they're inspired. They change when they're confronted. And confrontation is what wakes sleeping giants. He looked out at the faint glow of sunrise, soft, quiet, undramatic. Not like the speeches. Not like the headlines. But real. And that was the point. People think transformation feels explosive. It doesn't. It feels like dawn, subtle but unstoppable. As the first light spilled across the city, something unexplainable happened. Not in the world outside, but in the world within. The man in the worn suit got up from his table, walked to the mirror, and saw something he hadn't seen in years: a spark. A readiness. A refusal. He wasn't proud of his past, but he wasn't ashamed anymore either. Everything had led him here. Everything had prepared him for this moment. He whispered to his reflection, "From this day forward," and didn't need to finish the sentence. He knew the rest. The woman closed her laptop, stretching her sore fingers, but her eyes glowed with a fire that wasn't there yesterday. She looked out her window at the first light of dawn and felt something shift. A promise she made to herself. A promise she intended to keep this time. She stood taller, breathed deeper, and felt her destiny move a little closer, like it had been waiting for her call. The young man stepped outside just as the sun began to rise, its light brushing his face. He closed his eyes and felt the warmth, a signal, a reminder. He didn't know how long the road ahead would be. He didn't know how many failures lay between him and the life he wanted. But he knew one thing with absolute certainty: he would not walk away from himself again. And all across the city, in countless rooms, apartments, offices, and quiet corners, people felt that same subtle but seismic shift inside them. They didn't suddenly have all the answers. They didn't suddenly feel fearless. They didn't suddenly transform into new people overnight. But something had changed. Something permanent. Something irreversible. They had stopped lying to themselves. And the moment you stop lying to yourself is the moment destiny starts listening. Later that morning, the CEO stepped into the lobby of the building. A security guard nodded at him with newfound respect. Not because he was powerful, but because he spoke power into others. The CEO paused by the glass doors, watching the city come alive with the day. Most people rushing through the streets had no idea what had happened in that auditorium the night before. They didn't know a spark had been lit in a few souls that would set off a chain reaction for years to come. Because that's how destinies begin, not in crowds, not in applause, not in noise, but in quiet, private moments when one human finally decides to stop hiding from their potential. He walked outside, the morning air crisp against his skin, and he smiled, not because he was pleased with himself, but because he felt the shift in the world. The smallest shift, but the kind that grows. The kind that multiplies. The kind that changes lives quietly, steadily, unavoidably. He whispered to himself, "Some of them will make it." And he meant it. Because he knew that among the thousands who heard him, a few had been waiting for exactly that moment to wake up. And once awakened, they would never go back to sleep. In the weeks that followed, changes began, subtle at first, invisible to the outside eye. By the end of the month, the man in the worn suit had left the job that drained him and started building the project he abandoned years ago. The woman finally submitted the work she had been afraid to create, setting off a chain of opportunities she never expected. The young man launched the first version of his long-suppressed dream, imperfect but real, and the momentum began to build from there, and in time, months, then years, the ripples of that night grew into waves. Some stumbled, but they did not quit. Some failed, but they did not retreat. Some struggled, but they did not return to their old selves. Because once you glimpse the version of you that destiny is waiting for, you cannot live comfortably as the version destiny has outgrown, and as each person rose, faltered, learned, built, broke, rebuilt, and evolved, they realized something powerful. The billionaire CEO had never been talking about their future, he was talking to the warrior inside them, the warrior tied down by fear, the warrior silenced by doubt. The warrior buried under expectations, the warrior exhausted by pretending, the warrior desperate to rise, the warrior they finally let out, and in the end, the truth became stunningly clear. Destiny had never been a path, it had always been a person, the person they finally chose to become.